A thin tendril of sunlight penetrated the dark room, causing Dr. Laura Hale to stir. Her eyes gradually registered the change, eventually reopening to the new reality she had desperately hoped had been a bad dream. No such luck. The living nightmare she'd experienced for the past 48 hours was real, with no end in sight. She started to drift back to sleep, thinking there was no real hurry to leave, and she needed the sleep. Hale could count the hours she'd slept over the past 2 days on one hand. A sudden, distant burst of automatic gunfire triggered enough adrenaline to elevate her heart rate and put a temporary hold on her hopes of drifting off. The sound of gunfire no longer overtly started Hale, but on a subconscious level, it still triggered her fight-or-flight response. A second burst cut through the morning, and she opened her eyes. Time to get up and figure out her next move. Not that she had a lot of options. Last night's drive from the hospital to Dr. Chang's apartment had revealed a frightening shift in the city's dynamic. Her previous trip to the apartment, less than 24 hours earlier, had been mostly uneventful. Aside from a few police or ambulance sirens, the streets had been empty. Last night, the streets teemed with people, most of them engaged in looting or glitchy behavior. Hale had witnessed a number of attacks by small mobs, unable to tell if the victim was one of the infected or the other way around. But she didn't stick around long enough to figure it out. Vehicles drew unwanted attention, evidenced by several new dents in the side of the SUV she borrowed from Dr. Owens. A sizable swarm of crazies nearly trapped her at the intersection of Delaware and Michigan when she slowed to observe the sea of flames engulfing the nearby Old National Theater. If someone had smashed her window, they could have dragged her onto the street. Panicked by the realization of her vulnerability, she quickly drove straight to Chang's place without slowing. A quick glance around the apartment indicated that the power was still on in the city. The microwave's green digital display read 6:50 a.m. Her wristwatch concurred. Hale truly had no idea what she'd do with the rest of the day. Probably sleep, eat, and wait for sunset. She couldn't help but presume that she'd have a better chance of safely slipping out when it was dark. There was no way to hide during broad daylight. Then again, the crazies had been up all night from what she could tell. Maybe it got quiet in the morning, while they slept off a long night of looting and murdering or whatever they were up to. There would be no way to tell until she hit the streets, on foot. The SUV was no longer a viable option. Even if she avoided running into another mob, she couldn't dodge the government. The quarantine boundary sounded serious. The military would either turn her around or put her in a quarantine camp. Neither option sounded promising. Another round of gunfire erupted, this cluster of shots sounding a lot closer than the last. The sharp crackle and pop of semi-automatic fire intensified while she lay on the couch, quickly reaching a frenetic cadence that lasted several minutes. It sounded like a protracted street battle had taken place a few blocks away. So much for the city going quiet. Hale swung her legs onto the hardwood floor and rubbed her face. First order of business would be coffee and food. Her brief inspection of the apartment last night had revealed that Chang kept the place reasonably stocked, especially for a bachelor. She found a lot of dried foods like rice, beans, and other grains on the shelves of the walk-in pantry, along with rows of various canned goods. Several cases of bottled water sat on the pantry floor, which would come in handy when she left. A little later, she'd inspect the other rooms for camping gear or anything that might make her trek more bearable. Hale had no delusions about what lay ahead for her. Walking out of here was going to be a challenge on every level. The crazies roaming the streets were only part of the problem. Living off the land, or whatever she could find here, until she could sneak out of the quarantine zone would challenge her limited outdoor skills.